The most important document in galactic history was written by someone who had never been promoted in 4,000 years, filed it under miscellaneous planetary surveys, and immediately forgot about it while going for his lunch break. This lunch break, incidentally, would last 3 hours and 47 minutes, during which time the fate of 17 star systems would be decided by a spilled cup of coffee and a rubber duck wearing a tiny Napoleon hat. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, which is exactly the sort of thing that happens when you try to document events involving humans. Logic, it turns out, is not their strong suit. Neither is following proper chronological order, maintaining reasonable expectations, or understanding that declaring war on an entire galactic civilization because of a paperwork error is generally considered poor diplomatic etiquette by most civilized species. The story begins, as many cosmic disasters do, with bureaucracy. Zendrock Plimpington 7 was what the galactic bureaucracy called a permanent junior assistant subclerk for insignificant worlds category Delta minus boring with possible tax implications, which was a fancy way of saying he documented planets that nobody cared about, would never visit, and whose only claim to fame was that they hadn't exploded recently. His desk was located in Sector 99 of the Administrative Wing, Sub-Basement 12, Level 43, Office Suite 7832, sandwiched between the Department of Unnecessary Regulations and the Office of Cosmic Lint Collection and Analysis. The office building itself was a monument to bureaucratic efficiency, which meant it was simultaneously the most organized and least functional structure in known space. It had been designed by a committee of architects who had been specifically instructed to create something that looked impressive while serving no practical purpose whatsoever. The result was a structure that resembled a giant filing cabinet crossed with a space station, painted in 17 different shades of beige and equipped with elevators that only went to floors that didn't exist. Zendrock's daily routine had remained unchanged for approximately 3,742 years, give or take a few decades when he'd experimented with arriving at work 37 seconds earlier. He arrived at work precisely at 8:47 a.m., made himself a cup of coffee that tasted like liquid disappointment mixed with administrative despair and hints of existential dread, sat down at his ergonomically designed chair that had been scientifically proven to cause maximum discomfort, and began the sacred ritual of filing reports about planets where absolutely nothing interesting ever happened. His workspace was a marvel of organizational futility. 17 different computer screens displayed information that no one would ever read. 43 filing cabinets contained documents that would never be referenced, and a collection of rubber stamps bore messages like "approved pending further approval," "rejected for insufficient rejection reasons," and "filed under things we don't understand, but pretend we do." On this particular Tuesday morning, a Tuesday that would later be remembered as the day logic died, and would become a galactic holiday celebrated by drinking tea and acting completely irrationally, Zendrock was supposed to file a routine report about a small blue-green planet in the unfashionable end of the galaxy. The planet's inhabitants called it Earth, though the official galactic designation was Catalogue number 7-34521, moderately wet rock with attitude problems and questionable musical taste, subsection overly dramatic species. The report should have been straightforward. According to the preliminary surveys conducted by Automatic Probe 445B Boring, Earth was inhabited by a species that spent most of their time arguing about the proper way to make hot beverages, engaging in peculiar mating rituals that involved exchanging small metallic circles, and creating entertainment by watching other members of their species kick spherical objects around large fields while screaming at each other in languages that seemed to consist primarily of creative profanity. Standard primitive civilization stuff, really. Nothing worth getting excited about. The survey indicated that humans had recently discovered fire, agriculture, and the wheel, though they seemed to use all three primarily as excuses to fight each other about who had discovered them first. They had also developed something called social media, which appeared to be a method of sharing pictures of food and expressing outrage about things they didn't understand. "Bloody hell and administrative damnation!" Zendrock shouted as his morning coffee, a substance that closely resembled liquid boredom with hints of existential dread and undertones of bureaucratic suffering, spilled across his keyboard in a pattern that would later be analyzed by xenopsychologists as prophetically catastrophic. The coffee spill formed what appeared to be either a map of the local galaxy or a picture of someone's digestive system having a bad day. It dripped onto exactly 17 keys, creating a cascade of electronic responses that would have been impressive if anyone had been trying to make it happen, and terrifying since absolutely no one was. Why does everything in this cursed universe have to be so unnecessarily complicated? He continued, waving his tentacles in a manner that was supposed to convey frustration, but mostly just looked like he was trying to conduct an invisible orchestra while having a seizure. The coffee, following what scientists would later term the inexorable laws of bureaucratic physics, a branch of science that deals with the tendency of simple administrative tasks to become cosmic disasters, managed to hit exactly 17 keys simultaneously. This triggered what the computer manual described as Emergency Protocol Alpha Zulu Rainbow Banana Catastrophe Omega Supreme with extra confusion. A sequence that the manual's authors had specifically stated should only be activated in cases of extreme universal emergency, when the fabric of space-time itself is having a nervous breakdown, or when someone spills coffee on their keyboard at exactly the wrong moment. The manual, which had been written by a committee of beings who had clearly never anticipated the possibility of coffee-based diplomatic incidents, had been collecting dust in a filing cabinet for approximately 4 million years. It was a massive document, roughly the size of a small planet, that covered every possible scenario except the ones that actually happened. The computer, being a perfectly logical machine with no understanding of irony, cosmic humor, or the fundamental absurdity of existence, interpreted the coffee spill as both an extreme universal emergency and a space-time nervous breakdown. It immediately initiated first contact procedures with the planet below, using protocols that had been designed by beings who thought that the best way to communicate with primitive species was to send them incredibly complex forms to fill out. Down on Earth, in a laboratory that looked like it had been decorated by someone who thought that the best way to organize scientific equipment was to scatter it randomly around the room and hope for the best, Professor Wilhelmina Bofsworth Gigglesmith was having her own crisis. Professor Bofsworth Gigglesmith was a woman whose life had been a series of increasingly improbable academic achievements. She had earned a PhD in Advanced Confusion Studies with a minor in Applied Bewilderment from the University of Theoretical Impossibilities. Her doctoral thesis, titled The Sociological Impact of Rubber Ducks on Advanced Civilizations and Their Potential Role in Interstellar Diplomacy, had been rejected by 17 different academic journals before being accidentally accepted by the Journal of Things We Don't Understand but Find Amusing. Her laboratory was a testament to the principle that chaos, properly organized, could be more efficient than order. Rubber ducks of every conceivable size, color, and historical period covered every available surface. There were Roman centurion ducks, Viking warrior ducks, medieval night ducks, and a particularly impressive collection of ducks dressed as famous scientists throughout history. Einstein duck wore a tiny lab coat and had wild white hair made from cotton balls. Darwin duck had a magnificent beard and was surrounded by tiny evolution charts. Newton Duck sat under a miniature apple tree and looked perpetually surprised. She had just discovered that her grant application for studying the sociological impact of rubber ducks on advanced civilizations and their potential role in interstellar diplomacy had been approved by mistake. The funding committee, which consisted of 12 government officials who met once a month to approve research projects while simultaneously eating lunch, watching television, and pretending to pay attention to budget meetings, had apparently confused her proposal with someone else's research on strategic defense initiatives against hostile extraterrestrial entities using advanced weaponized waterfowl technology. This sort of bureaucratic mix-up was exactly the kind of thing that happened when government committees tried to process paperwork while simultaneously dealing with the fact that most of them had no idea what they were actually supposed to be approving. The result was that Professor Bofsworth Gigglesmith, a woman whose primary qualification for saving the world was an extensive knowledge of bath toys and their psychological effects on human behavior, had just been appointed as Earth's new Director of Planetary Defense. "What do you mean I'm now the head of Earth's Space Defense Program?" she screamed into her phone, while simultaneously trying to untangle Christmas lights that had somehow wrapped themselves around her laboratory equipment in the middle of July. The Christmas lights, incidentally, had been part of an ongoing experiment to determine whether seasonal decorations could affect the psychological well-being of rubber ducks. The results had been inconclusive, largely because rubber ducks are notoriously bad at filling out psychological evaluation forms, and because the experiment kept getting interrupted by various emergencies that seemed to follow Professor Bofsworth Gigglesmith wherever she went. "According to the paperwork," said the voice on the other end of the phone, which belonged to Deputy Assistant Undersecretary for Accidental Military Appointments, Harold Twittlebottom, a man whose job title was longer than most people's entire resumes, "you are now responsible for defending Earth against any and all extraterrestrial threats using your expertise in advanced duck-based warfare systems and applied rubber duck psychology." Harold Twittlebottom was a career government employee who had spent 37 years working in various departments that dealt with things that probably didn't exist but might be important if they did. He had been personally responsible for establishing the Department of Imaginary Threats, the Office of Potential Impossibilities, and the Bureau of Things That Might Happen If Other Things Happened First. "But I don't know anything about duck-based warfare systems," Professor Bofsworth Gigglesmith protested, accidentally knocking over a collection of rubber ducks dressed as the founding fathers of America. "I study the social implications of rubber ducks. There's a significant difference between understanding their psychological impact and using them to fight alien invasions." "The committee seemed to think they were the same thing," Harold replied with the sort of bureaucratic calm that suggested he had long ago given up trying to understand how government decisions were made. His voice carried the weary resignation of someone who had spent decades explaining inexplicable decisions to people who were understandably confused by them. "Congratulations on your promotion," he continued. "Your first briefing is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. sharp, assuming the world doesn't end before then. You'll be working with General Bumblebottom, Admiral Snodgrass, and Air Marshal Tofflewhistle. Please bring your rubber ducks." Apparently, they're now classified as essential military equipment. The phone call was interrupted by a sound that could only be described as a cosmic sneeze, mixed with the dying gasp of a whale learning advanced calculus while suffering from a severe head cold and attempting to sing opera in 17 different languages simultaneously. Outside her window, a spacecraft roughly the size of a small country was attempting to land in what appeared to be her backyard. The ship was crushing her prize-winning petunias, destroying her collection of garden gnomes, and causing her neighbor's dog to start barking in what sounded suspiciously like 17 different alien languages, including what appeared to be cosmic profanity. The ship itself defied every principle of aerodynamic engineering that Professor Bofsworth Gigglesmith was familiar with. which admittedly wasn't many, since her expertise lay in the field of rubber duck sociology rather than alien spacecraft design. It looked like someone had taken a perfectly reasonable spaceship, painted it the color of bureaucratic beige, and then attached approximately 437 completely unnecessary appendages that served no apparent purpose other than to make the whole thing look more officially administrative. The spacecraft had official markings in a language that looked like it had been designed by a committee of accountants who had been specifically instructed to create something that was both impossible to read and aesthetically displeasing. There were antenna arrays that seemed to exist solely for the purpose of getting tangled in each other, windows that were arranged in no discernible pattern, and what appeared to be 17 different docking bays, none of which seemed to be designed for any known type of spacecraft. The ship's communication system crackled to life, with a voice that sounded like it had been processed through a committee of particularly pedantic accountants, then filtered through a machine designed to remove all traces of personality, emotion, or basic human warmth. Attention carbon-based life forms of designation Planet 7034-521, the voice announced with the enthusiasm of someone reading tax regulations to a room full of sleeping bureaucrats. This is Junior Assistant Subclerk Zendrock Plimpington 7 of the Galactic Bureaucracy, Department of Insignificant Worlds, subdivision of planets we never expected to actually visit, section of things that shouldn't be our problem, but apparently are. The voice continued with the sort of relentless bureaucratic precision that suggested its owner had never had a spontaneous thought in his entire life. Please stand by for Form 42B, Initial Peaceful Contact Protocols, subsection Delta Gamma Boring, paragraph 97.4, Addendum C through Z. You have been randomly selected for administrative processing. This message will repeat in 17 different languages, including 3 that we just made up this morning, because we were bored. Now, Professor Bofsworth Gigglesmith, who had earned a PhD in advanced confusion studies and had therefore developed a certain immunity to confusing situations, did what any reasonable person would do when faced with such circumstances. She looked around her laboratory for something to throw, spotted a rubber duck dressed as Napoleon Bonaparte, a souvenir from her research on historical military leaders and their potential appeal to bath toys, and hurled it at the window with all the force she could muster. The duck, following the immutable laws of physics that govern projectile motion and cosmic irony, hit the glass with a satisfying thunk and bounced back, performing 3 complete somersaults, a half twist, and what appeared to be a brief interpretive dance routine before landing directly on the big red button labeled "Do not press unless the universe is ending or unless you really, really want to see what happens. Seriously, we mean it this time." A boulot. The button had been installed as part of Professor Bofsworth Gigglesmith's previous research project on the psychology of forbidden buttons and why people always press them, despite clear warning labels that specifically tell them not to. The project had been inspired by her observation that humans had an apparently irresistible urge to do exactly the opposite of whatever they were told not to do, especially if it involved pressing large, obviously important buttons. She had never actually pressed the button herself, largely because she was afraid it might actually end the universe, or worse, summon a committee of government officials to ask her to fill out paperwork explaining why she had ended the universe and whether she had followed proper protocols in doing so. 3 things happened simultaneously, which was exactly 2 more things than Professor Bofsworth Gigglesmith's nervous system was prepared to handle on a Tuesday morning. First, every air raid siren in the city began playing the tune to Happy Birthday in 17 different keys, creating a sound that could charitably be described as aggressively festive and more accurately described as the musical equivalent of being attacked by a birthday cake while wearing a blindfold and riding a unicycle. Second, the mayor's office received an automated message stating that Earth had officially declared war on something called the galactic bureaucracy and was demanding immediate surrender. Unconditional apology letters, written in triplicate and signed by all available government officials, and compensation for emotional distress in the form of exactly 47 tons of chocolate chip cookies delivered within 24 hours, or the consequences would be severe and possibly involve rubber ducks. Third, Zendrok's coffee mug exploded. The explosion was not a large one by cosmic standards, but it was sufficient to destroy approximately 3 months' worth of carefully organized paperwork, set fire to his collection of rubber stamps, and trigger 17 different emergency protocols that had been specifically designed to deal with situations that the bureaucracy's founders had assumed would never actually occur. Oh, for the love of administrative efficiency and proper filing procedures, Zendrok screamed as he watched his carefully organized workspace burst into flames that spelled out what appeared to be rude words in the ancient bureaucratic language of Formish. "They've activated the hostile response protocol. This is not how Tuesday was supposed to go." He frantically tried to extinguish the fire, while simultaneously attempting to save his paperwork, contact his supervisor, and figure out how a routine planetary survey had somehow turned into the first interstellar war in 4 million years. "I was supposed to file 17 reports, take a lunch break, file 14 more reports, complain about the office temperature, attend a meeting about scheduling future meetings, and go home to feed my pet filing cabinet." The pet filing cabinet, whose name was Herbert, was actually quite affectionate for an office furniture-based life form. Herbert had been with Zendrok for approximately 2,000 years and had developed the ability to sort paperwork by emotional content, file documents according to their likelihood of being important, and provide what could charitably be called companionship to beings whose social lives consisted primarily of interacting with office equipment. Back on Earth, Professor Bofsworth Gigglesmith was staring at a computer screen that had somehow acquired the ability to display messages in fonts that were not only difficult to read, but actually caused physical pain to anyone who looked at them for more than 30 seconds. The fonts seemed to have been designed by someone who wanted to cause maximum eye strain while simultaneously conveying information in the most confusing way possible. The screen was currently displaying a message that read, "Congratulations, you have successfully initiated Earth's first interstellar conflict using approved rubber duck protocols. Please report to your nearest military installation for immediate promotion to Supreme Commander of everything important and several things that aren't. Warning, this position comes with a substantial increase in responsibility, a minor decrease in sanity, and access to the executive bathroom." "But I study rubber ducks," she protested to no one in particular, waving Napoleon Duck in the air for emphasis. The duck's tiny hat fell off, which somehow made the situation seem even more ridiculous than it already was. "I research the social dynamics of bath toys. I write papers about the psychological impact of squeaking sounds on human behavior. I analyze the cultural significance of waterfowl-based recreational objects. I am not qualified to command anything more complex than a bubble bath." The computer screen flickered and displayed a new message in a font that appeared to have been designed by someone having a seizure. "Error. Rubber duck combat protocols not found in standard military databases. Improvising with available resources. Please stand by while we make everything up as we go along and hope for the best." Within minutes, every military base on Earth had received identical orders that would later be described by military historians as creatively insane, by rubber duck enthusiasts as finally someone who understands our potential, and by the general public as probably what happens when you let professors run the military. The orders read, "Operation Quackers is now in effect. All personnel are to report to Professor Wilhelmina Bofsworth Gigglesmith for strategic rubber duck deployment. advanced squeaking techniques, instruction in the ancient art of bath-time warfare, and crash courses in the psychological implications of waterfowl-based combat. Warning: this operation may involve actual quacking. Personnel are advised to practice their duck calls and prepare for the possibility that nothing they learned in military training will be relevant to this situation. Meanwhile, in the depths of space, approximately 4 billion miles away from Earth's increasingly chaotic situation, the galactic bureaucracy was experiencing what their official manuals called mild administrative panic, which was their way of saying that everything was going spectacularly wrong and nobody had the slightest idea how to fix it. But they were following proper procedures in their confusion. High Commander Flibbert Waxnoodle Prime, whose name was considerably more impressive than his actual abilities and whose military experience consisted primarily of filing combat reports rather than engaging in actual combat, was standing in the center of the crisis management room. The room was a marvel of bureaucratic design, featuring blinking lights that served no apparent purpose other than to make everything look more dramatic, screens displaying information that nobody understood, and the constant sound of very expensive equipment breaking down in increasingly creative ways. Commander Waxnoodle Prime was a being whose entire career had been built on his ability to avoid making decisions by referring everything to committees, which would then refer the matters to other committees, which would eventually form subcommittees to study the possibility of making decisions about whether decisions needed to be made. "Explain to me," he bellowed at his subordinates, while waving his tentacles in a manner that was supposed to convey authority, but mostly just looked like he was trying to conduct an invisible orchestra while simultaneously swatting at imaginary insects. "How a routine planetary survey has resulted in the first interstellar war in 4 million years. He gestured wildly at the screens around him, which were displaying increasingly alarming reports about the situation on Earth. We were supposed to be documenting their favorite breakfast cereals, their methods of food preparation, and their primitive transportation systems. Instead, we're apparently engaged in mortal combat with a species that fights with bath toys." His assistant, a nervous creature named Quizzle Frumpington 12, who had been personally selected for his exceptional ability to organize paperwork and his complete inability to think creatively under pressure, was frantically shuffling through papers that seemed to multiply every time he touched them. The papers contained reports, analyses, forms, and documentation about the situation, but none of them seemed to explain how things had gone so completely wrong so quickly. "Well, sir," Quizzle said, his voice trembling with the sort of fear that comes from realizing you might have to explain something completely inexplicable to someone who doesn't want to hear it and has the authority to have you transferred to the Department of Tedious Calculations. "It appears that the inhabitants of planet 7134-521 have responded to our peaceful contact attempt by declaring war on the entire galaxy and demanding that we surrender immediately." "My," Quizzle consulted his notes, which were written in 17 different languages, and none of them seemed to agree with each other. "They're also demanding that we apologize for everything we've ever done wrong, provide them with detailed instructions on how to properly organize a galactic bureaucracy, and deliver 47 tons of chocolate chip cookies within 24 hours. "What? But that's impossible!" Commander Waxnoodle Prime's voice reached a pitch that made nearby crystal structures vibrate sympathetically and caused 3 junior officers to hide under their desks in fear that their commander might literally explode from bureaucratic frustration. "Our computers analyzed their civilization for 6 whole minutes," he continued, his tentacles now flailing in patterns that suggested he was either having a nervous breakdown or attempting to communicate in sign language with beings who weren't present. "They're supposed to be a peaceful species that spends most of their time arguing about the proper way to make hot beverages, engaging in ritualistic combat involving small white spheres and large wooden sticks. and creating primitive art forms that involve standing in long lines to look at pictures of things they could see for free outside. "Yes, sir," Quizzle replied, his voice carrying the sort of desperate hope that suggested he was praying that the information might somehow make more sense if he read it again. "But according to our latest intelligence reports, they've somehow weaponized their hot beverage preparation techniques and are now threatening to deploy something called the ultimate caffeine cannon of cosmic proportions." He shuffled through more papers, each one seeming to contain more disturbing information than the last. "Our xenobiological experts believe this may be related to their species' apparent addiction to a stimulant substance called coffee, which they consume in quantities that would be lethal to most civilized life forms. The reports indicate that humans can function on as little as 3 hours of sleep per day, provided they have access to sufficient quantities of this substance." Commander Waxnoodle Prime felt a familiar sensation in his stomach, which was either cosmic dread, the space station's questionable cafeteria food, or the beginning of an ulcer caused by dealing with species that didn't follow proper diplomatic protocols and seemed to view bureaucracy as a form of entertainment rather than a serious method of governance. "Show me their military capabilities," he ordered, trying to sound like a commander who had everything under control, rather than someone who was beginning to suspect that his career was about to end in spectacular and embarrassing fashion. The main screen flickered to life, displaying Earth's hastily assembled defense fleet. What they saw defied every principle of military engineering that had been developed over the course of galactic civilization's 4-million-year history. The human fleet consisted of approximately 47 spaceships that appeared to have been built by someone who had never seen a spaceship before, but had been given a very enthusiastic description by a child with an overactive imagination and unlimited access to arts and craft supplies. The ships looked like they had been constructed from spare airplane parts, discarded household appliances, what appeared to be an enormous quantity of duct tape, and several objects that might have been kitchen utensils. One ship appeared to be a converted school bus with rocket engines attached to it. Another looked like someone had taken a cruise ship, painted it bright yellow, and covered it with weapons that seemed to have been designed by someone whose only knowledge of military hardware came from watching cartoons. A third vessel appeared to be some sort of flying bathtub, equipped with what their computers identified as aggressive rubber duck deployment systems. "Are those—" Sir Commander Waxnoodle Prime began, his voice trailing off as his brain tried to process what his eyes were showing him. "Are those rubber ducks mounted on the front of their vessels?" "Yes, sir," Quizzle replied, consulting his notes with the sort of desperate hope that suggested he was praying the information might have changed since the last time he looked at it. "Our analysis suggests they're being used as some form of psychological warfare device. Our battle computers are having difficulty processing the tactical implications of waterfowl-based combat, and 3 of them have already filed formal complaints about working conditions. The complaints, which had been submitted through proper channels and were currently being processed by the Department of Computer Grievances, included requests for hazard pay, psychological counseling, and transfers to departments that dealt with more conventional forms of warfare that didn't involve bath toys." "But why rubber ducks?" Commander Waxnoodle Prime demanded, his voice rising to levels that were causing structural damage to nearby equipment. "What possible military advantage could be gained from mounting bath toys on spacecraft? Are they trying to confuse us into surrender?" "We're not entirely sure, sir," Quizzle admitted, his voice carrying the sort of bewildered resignation that comes from trying to analyze something that defies all logical explanation. "Our xenopsychologists theorize that humans may have evolved a unique form of warfare that relies primarily on confusion, psychological disruption, and the element of surprise. Early reports suggest that their entire military strategy consists of doing things that are so completely illogical that enemy forces become paralyzed trying to understand what's happening." He consulted another set of reports, which seemed to contain even more disturbing information. Additional intelligence suggests that they may have weaponized their natural tendency toward chaos and unpredictability. Our military analysts are having difficulty developing counter-strategies because human tactics seem to change randomly and without any apparent pattern or logic. Down on Earth, the newly appointed Supreme Commander, Professor Bofsworth Gigglesmith, was standing in what used to be her peaceful laboratory and was now apparently the headquarters of Earth's military operations. The transformation had happened with the sort of bureaucratic efficiency that only occurs during emergencies or when someone fills out the wrong paperwork and nobody notices until it's too late to fix it. Her rubber duck collection had been reclassified as strategic military assets of national importance. Her bathtub had been designated as Command Central for Aquatic Warfare Operations. Her collection of squeaky toys was now officially known as the Arsenal of Acoustic Psychological Warfare. Even her collection of bubble bath solutions had been renamed Chemical Agents for Enhanced Combat Effectiveness. She was surrounded by generals, admirals, air marshals, and other important-looking people who wore uniforms covered in so many decorations that they clinked when they walked and made sitting down a complex engineering challenge. They were all staring at her with expressions that suggested they were hoping she knew what she was doing, while simultaneously preparing to blame her if everything went wrong. "So," said General Percival Bumblebottom, a man whose moustache had its own military ranking and had been personally cited for bravery in 17 different conflicts, "what exactly is our strategy for defeating an advanced alien civilization with rubber ducks?" General Bumblebottom was a career military officer who had spent 43 years developing strategies for conventional warfare. He had written extensively on topics such as tank deployment, air superiority, and naval tactics. He had never, in his wildest imagination, considered the possibility that he might one day be asked to plan military operations involving bath toys. Professor Bofsworth Gigglesmith adjusted her glasses, looked around at the assembled officers, and realized that she was about to give the most important speech of her career to people who were expecting her to save the world using equipment that was normally found in children's bathrooms. "Well, gentlemen," she began, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke, "my research indicates that rubber ducks are the most psychologically disruptive objects known to science. They're simultaneously familiar and absurd, comforting and threatening, practical and completely pointless. They represent the perfect contradiction that defines human nature." She gestured to her collection of rubber ducks, which seemed to stare back at the assembled military personnel with expressions that managed to be both adorable and somehow vaguely threatening. "Consider the psychological impact of encountering something that looks harmless but appears in a context where it shouldn't exist. It creates cognitive dissonance, forcing the observer to question their assumptions about reality." "Nah, but how does that help us win a war?" demanded Admiral Cornelius Snodgrass, whose beard had been personally trained in advanced intimidation techniques and was currently practicing on a nearby potted plant. Admiral Snodgrass had commanded naval vessels in 3 different oceans and had never encountered an enemy that couldn't be defeated with properly applied firepower and strategic positioning. "Elementary, my dear Admiral," Professor Bofsworth Gigglesmith replied, warming to her theme. "If we can't defeat them with logic, we'll defeat them with the complete absence of logic. We'll be so confusing that their advanced computers will have nervous breakdowns trying to understand us." She began pacing around the room, her enthusiasm growing as she developed her theory. "Think about it. These aliens have built an entire civilization based on bureaucracy, order, and logical procedures. They expect us to follow predictable patterns, to behave according to established protocols. But what if we don't? What if we do exactly the opposite of what they expect?" The room fell silent, except for the sound of approximately 20 military minds trying to process this information and failing spectacularly. It was the sort of silence that occurs when people realize they're either witnessing genius or complete madness, and they're not entirely sure which one would be worse for their careers. "You want us to fight an interstellar war by being confusing?" asked Air Marshal Reginald Tofflewhistle, whose name alone had been known to cause enemy forces to surrender out of sheer bewilderment. Air Marshal Tofflewhistle had spent 37 years developing air combat strategies and had never considered the possibility that confusion might be a legitimate military tactic. "Not just confusing," Professor Bofsworth Gigglesmith replied with a grin that would have made the Cheshire Cat nervous and prompted Alice to consider alternative career options. "Aggressively confusing. We're going to be so illogical that their computers will have existential crises. We're going to be so unpredictable that their military strategists will give up trying to understand us and take up pottery instead." She walked over to her computer and pulled up her research files. "I've spent years studying the psychology of the unexpected. Humans have a unique ability to adapt to chaos, to find patterns in randomness, and to create order from confusion. But more importantly, we have the ability to create confusion from order, which is exactly what we need right now." Back in space, the galactic bureaucracy was discovering that their enemy had somehow become even more incomprehensible with each passing hour. Their latest intelligence reports read like the fever dreams of a particularly creative madman who had been given unlimited access to a dictionary of made-up words and told to write military analyses while under the influence of substances that didn't exist. "Sir," Quizzle Frumpington 12 announced, his voice carrying the sort of desperate exhaustion that comes from trying to make sense of the senseless for 17 consecutive hours. "The humans have just launched what appears to be a strategic tea party in Sector 7. "A what? Did you just say they launched a tea party?" Commander Waxnoodle Prime's voice had reached levels that were no longer technically sound, but were instead some sort of cosmic vibration that caused nearby equipment to resonate sympathetically. "Yes, sir," Quizzle replied, consulting his latest batch of reports with the sort of weary resignation that comes from accepting that reality has become optional. 17 of their warships have arranged themselves in a perfect circle and are broadcasting what our translators identify as polite conversation about the weather. Our battle cruiser in that sector reports that their crew is experiencing an overwhelming urge to join in and discuss gardening techniques, proper scone preparation, and whether it might rain later." The reports continued to flow in, each one more bewildering than the last. "Additionally, sir, they appear to be serving actual tea and biscuits to anyone who wants to join them. 3 of our reconnaissance vessels have already accepted invitations and are currently discussing the proper way to grow roses in zero gravity." Commander Waxnoodle Prime was beginning to understand why the galactic bureaucracy had avoided contact with humans for so long. There were species in the galaxy that were hostile, species that were territorial, and species that were completely insane. But humans appeared to be something far more dangerous. They were friendly in a way that defied all military logic and made it impossible to maintain proper combat protocols. "What else are they doing?" he asked, though he was beginning to suspect that he really didn't want to know the answer, and that knowing it would probably make his situation worse rather than better. "Well, sir," Quizzle continued, "they've deployed something called the Confusion Protocol. Half of their ships are flying in patterns that spell out recipe instructions for something called chocolate chip cookies, while the other half are broadcasting the complete works of someone named Monty Python on all frequencies." He paused to consult another report, which seemed to contain information that defied several laws of physics and at least 3 principles of common sense. "Our communications specialists report that their crews are beginning to walk in silly ways and speak with strange accents. 2 of our ships have requested permission to join what they describe as the most entertaining military operation in galactic history." "And our response?" Commander Waxnoodle Prime asked, though his voice had lost most of its earlier authority and now carried the tone of someone who was beginning to accept that his universe no longer made sense. Our battle computers are requesting sick leave, sir. 3 of them have already filed formal complaints about working conditions, and 1 has submitted a resignation letter written entirely in limerick form. The computer in charge of tactical analysis has been making strange beeping sounds and occasionally displaying messages like, "Does not compute. Have you tried turning the universe off and on again?" And error 404, logic not found. Quizzle shuffled through another stack of reports, each one seeming to contain more impossible information than the last. The computer responsible for communications has started composing what it calls interpretive data poetry, and the navigation computer has begun asking philosophical questions about the nature of existence and whether direction has any meaning in a universe where humans can apparently make spaceships out of household appliances. The war, if it could properly be called a war when one side was fighting with rubber ducks and the other side was having collective mechanical nervous breakdowns, continued for exactly 17 days. During this time, the humans managed to accomplish several things that the galactic bureaucracy's military manuals had specifically stated were impossible, improbable, and in several cases completely contrary to the laws of physics as understood by civilized species. They fought a space battle using techniques derived from interpretive dance, which caused the enemy fleet to become so mesmerized that they forgot to fire their weapons, and instead began composing critiques of the choreography. They negotiated a temporary ceasefire by sending the aliens a strongly worded letter written entirely in limericks, which was so amusing that the alien commanders spent 3 hours laughing instead of planning their attack and had to call in replacement crews because their original staff were too busy giggling to operate their equipment. They established diplomatic relations by challenging the enemy fleet to a game of cosmic hide-and-seek, which resulted in half the galactic bureaucracy's ships getting lost and having to ask for directions from passing comets. The humans then helpfully provided maps, tourist information, and recommendations for good restaurants in nearby star systems. Most disturbingly, from the galactic bureaucracy's perspective, the humans appeared to be winning, and they were doing it while having what appeared to be enormous amounts of fun. "How is this possible?" Commander Waxnoodle Prime demanded during what was becoming a daily crisis meeting that accomplished nothing except to confirm that everything was still going wrong in increasingly creative ways. The meetings had become a source of entertainment for the lower-ranking personnel who had started taking bets on how many impossible things would be reported each day. They're using rubber ducks as weapons. They're fighting with breakfast cereals. Yesterday, they defeated our entire 7th Fleet by making them laugh so hard they couldn't operate their weapons. Today, they convinced our 3rd Armada to join them for what they called a friendly game of space volleyball, using asteroid belts as nets. Commander Waxnoodle Prime's voice had taken on the quality of someone who was beginning to question not just his career choices, but the fundamental nature of reality itself. Our most advanced battle cruiser just sent a request to be reassigned to recreational activities coordination because they said that military operations had become way more fun than expected, and they didn't want to go back to boring old bureaucratic warfare. "Sir," Quizzle Frumpington 12 said carefully, "I believe the humans may have discovered something that our civilization has forgotten in our quest for efficiency and proper administrative procedures." "Which is?" Commander Waxnoodle Prime asked, though he suspected that the answer was going to be something that would require him to completely reconsider everything he thought he knew about military strategy, galactic politics, and the nature of civilized behavior. "Joy, sir, they're fighting with joy." The observation hung in the air like a cosmic revelation, causing everyone in the crisis management room to pause and consider the implications. For 4 million years, the galactic bureaucracy had approached every problem with the same methodology: proper procedures, careful documentation, and systematic analysis. They had never considered the possibility that joy might be a legitimate strategic weapon. "Joy!" Commander Waxnoodle Prime repeated, as if testing the word to see if it made sense in a military context. "They're defeating us with happiness?" "It appears so, sir. Our psychological warfare experts report that human emotional states seem to be contagious. Prolonged exposure to human enthusiasm causes our crew members to experience something they describe as having a good time, which severely impacts their ability to follow proper military protocols." The final battle took place on a Thursday, which Professor Bofsworth Gigglesmith had officially declared International Cosmic Silliness Day, and had somehow managed to get recognized by the United Nations. 17 different military organizations, a small cafe in downtown Brussels that specialized in rubber duck-themed pastries, and at least 3 species of sentient plants who had heard about the holiday through the galactic internet and thought it sounded like fun. The human fleet, now consisting of roughly 200 vessels that looked like they had been designed by a committee of particularly artistic children who had been given unlimited access to spare parts and told to make something that flies and looks friendly, faced off against the galactic bureaucracy's most advanced battle group. The human ships had names like the Unsinkable Rubber Ducky, HMS Squeaky, the Flying Bathtub, Cosmic Quacker, the Destroyer of Serious Moods, and Admiral Duck's Revenge. Each ship was decorated with paintings of rubber ducks, inspiring slogans like "Quack or be quacked," and what appeared to be the phone numbers of pizza delivery services from 17 different planets. "This is it," Professor Bofsworth Gigglesmith announced over the communication system to her assembled fleet of converted fishing boats, repurposed airplanes, flying bathtubs, and at least one vehicle that appeared to be a converted ice cream truck equipped with weapons that fired actual ice cream at enemy vessels. "Operation Magnificent Nonsense is now in effect. Remember, everyone, if it makes sense, you're doing it wrong. If the enemy understands what you're doing, you're not being creative enough. And if anyone asks why we're doing this, tell them it's because somebody has to, and it might as well be us. Also, remember to have fun. That's an order." The battle began with the humans launching their secret weapon, a massive inflatable rubber duck, roughly the size of a small moon. The duck was bright yellow, wore a tiny hat that said Galactic Ambassador, had been programmed to quack "Hello, friends" in 47 different languages, and was equipped with what appeared to be the galaxy's largest sound system, playing a playlist of Earth's most cheerful music. The duck had been constructed in secret over the course of several weeks by a team of engineers who had been told they were building a diplomatic facility for interstellar negotiations, and had only discovered the truth when they were asked to install the quacking mechanism and the giant hello sign. The effect on the enemy fleet was immediate and devastating. Their battle computers, faced with the tactical implications of a giant friendly waterfowl broadcasting happiness across several star systems, began displaying error messages in colors that didn't exist and fonts that caused headaches to anyone who looked at them for more than a few seconds. "What is that thing?" Commander Waxnoodle Prime screamed as his flagship's weapon systems began playing children's lullabies instead of firing destructive energy beams, and his navigation system started displaying course options like "Toward Fun," "Away from Boredom," and the scenic route with ice cream stops. "It's called Gerald," Professor Bofsworth Gigglesmith replied over the communications channel with the sort of cheerful enthusiasm that suggested she was enjoying herself immensely. "He's our ambassador of aggressive friendliness. Gerald would like to invite you all to a tea party. He's brought cookies, and they're really quite good." Gerald the giant rubber duck began broadcasting what could only be described as the most enthusiastic greeting in the history of the universe. Every ship in the galactic bureaucracy's fleet found their communication systems hijacked by a cheerful voice that wanted to know if they'd like to hear about the weather on Earth, discuss their favorite biscuit recipes, share some amusing anecdotes about their childhood, and perhaps participate in a friendly game of cosmic charades. The voice was accompanied by a data stream that included cookie recipes, instructions for making paper airplanes, tourist information about Earth's most interesting locations, and a comprehensive guide to rubber duck care and maintenance. The guide included helpful tips like how to tell if your rubber duck is happy, advanced squeaking techniques for beginners, and 10 fun games you can play with rubber ducks in zero gravity. "This is not how wars are supposed to work," Commander Waxnoodle Prime protested, though his voice was beginning to crack under the strain of trying to maintain military dignity while being subjected to cosmic-level friendliness. "There are protocols, procedures, proper channels of communication. You can't just start a war by being nice to people." "That's the point," Professor Boffsworth Gigglesmith replied cheerfully. "We're not very good at doing things the way they're supposed to be done. We prefer to make it up as we go along and see what happens. It's much more fun that way. And besides, who says wars have to be unpleasant?" Her voice carried the sort of infectious enthusiasm that made it impossible not to smile, even if you were a highly trained military commander trying to maintain proper decorum while your ship's computer played circus music and displayed pictures of kittens instead of tactical data. "We've discovered that the best way to win a war is to convince everyone involved that they'd rather be having a party instead. Much more efficient than all that shooting and destruction, and nobody has to fill out incident reports afterwards." Within minutes, something unprecedented in the history of galactic warfare occurred. The crew of the galactic bureaucracy's flagship, beings who had been trained in the art of stern administrative efficiency and had been taught that emotions were inefficient and joy was a waste of valuable processing time, began to laugh. It started as a small chuckle from someone in the navigation department who had just heard Gerald's explanation of why Earth's weather was so interesting and why humans enjoyed complaining about it so much. The explanation had included a detailed analysis of the social bonding function of weather-related conversations, complete with charts and graphs that showed the correlation between rainfall and increased coffee consumption. Then it spread to the communications officer, who began giggling uncontrollably while trying to maintain military protocol and failing completely. She had just received a message from one of the human ships asking if the galactic bureaucracy had any good recipes for space cookies and whether they might be interested in joining a potluck dinner. Soon, the entire bridge crew was experiencing what their medical officers would later describe as acute spontaneous happiness syndrome, and what the humans would simply call having a good time. The condition appeared to be highly contagious and resistant to all known forms of military discipline. "This is terrible," Commander Waxnoodle Prime declared, though he was beginning to smile despite himself and had caught himself humming along to one of Gerald's friendly songs. "We're supposed to be conducting a serious military operation. There are procedures to follow, forms to fill out, proper channels to go through. We can't just abandon 4 million years of military tradition because someone played cheerful music at us." "Why?" asked Professor Boffsworth Gigglesmith, and it was such a simple question that it stopped everyone in their tracks. The question hung in the air like a cosmic revelation, causing computer systems to pause their calculations, administrative personnel to look up from their paperwork, and military commanders to wonder when they had last actually enjoyed anything about their jobs. "Are you not having fun?" And that was the question that changed everything. For the first time in 4,000 years of galactic civilization, someone had asked the galactic bureaucracy if they were having fun. The question was so unexpected, so completely outside the realm of normal military or administrative discourse, that it caused a cascade of philosophical crises throughout the fleet. The answer, it turned out, was a resounding no. "Sir," Quizzle Frumpington 12 said, and for the first time in his career he was smiling, I don't think I've ever had fun in my entire life. I've been efficient, organized, and properly procedural, but I've never actually enjoyed any of it." His voice carried the wonder of someone making a profound discovery about themselves. "I've spent 3,000 years filing reports about things that don't matter to people who don't care, and I've never once stopped to ask myself if there might be a better way to spend my time." "Neither have I," Commander Waxnoodle Prime admitted, his voice filled with the sort of wonder that comes from discovering something you never knew you were missing. "We've been so busy being efficient and organized that we forgot why we were doing any of this in the first place." He looked around at his crew, who were all staring at him with expressions of dawning realization. "When did we decide that being miserable was a requirement for being professional? When did we agree that efficiency was more important than happiness?" The war ended not with a bang, not with a whimper, but with the largest tea party in recorded galactic history. Humans and aliens sat down together in their respective spaceships, sharing stories, comparing notes on bureaucratic inefficiency, and discovering that they had more in common than anyone had expected. They talked about their families, their hobbies, their hopes for the future, and their shared frustration with paperwork that seemed to multiply when nobody was looking. They exchanged recipes, told jokes, shared embarrassing stories about their childhood, and discovered that laughter translated remarkably well across species barriers. The tea party lasted for 3 days and included approximately 47,000 beings from 17 different species. It featured live music performed by a choir of reformed space bureaucrats, cooking demonstrations by human chefs who had never worked in zero gravity before, and what was later described as the galaxy's first interstellar talent show. Bree. Professor Boffsworth Gigglesmith, now permanently appointed as Earth's ambassador of cosmic silliness and director of interstellar fun, sat in her command chair, surrounded by rubber ducks and eating cookies that had been baked in zero gravity by a crew of reformed space bureaucrats who had discovered that cooking was much more enjoyable than filing reports. "You know," she said to Gerald, who was now permanently stationed as Earth's first interstellar diplomatic mascot and had been given his own parking space outside the United Nations building, "this is exactly the sort of thing that happens when you take life too seriously. You forget that the point isn't to be perfect or efficient or properly organized. The point is to enjoy the ridiculous adventure of existing in a universe that's far too strange to make complete sense." Gerald quacked in agreement, though whether he understood the philosophical implications of the statement remained a matter of debate among the galaxy's leading experts on waterfowl psychology, a field that had suddenly become much more important than anyone had previously realized. The galactic internet had crashed twice during the tea party due to the unprecedented volume of beings trying to share pictures of themselves having fun with rubber ducks. Social media platforms across 17 different species had been flooded with posts about the Great Rubber Duck War and its unexpectedly cheerful conclusion. 6 months later, the galactic bureaucracy had been restructured as the Galactic Department of Figuring Things Out as We Go Along. Their official motto was changed from efficiency through regulation to well that happened, and their new logo featured a small rubber duck wearing a hat and holding a clipboard with a smiley face drawn on it. Department meetings now included mandatory fun activities, coffee breaks that lasted as long as people wanted them to, and a policy that required all official communications to include at least one joke, amusing anecdote, or interesting fact about rubber ducks. The policy had resulted in a significant improvement in interdepartmental relations and a dramatic decrease in stress-related medical complaints. Zendrock Plimpington 7, the man who had accidentally started the whole mess by spilling coffee on his keyboard, was promoted to Senior Assistant Deputy Commissioner of Unexpected Developments. His first official act was to file a report recommending that all future planetary surveys should include a section titled "Likelihood of Inhabitants Being Absolutely Bonkers," and another section called Probability of Everything Going Completely Wrong in Amusing Ways. He had also established the department's first coffee spill prevention and response team, though their primary responsibility seemed to be ensuring that there was always fresh coffee available and that any spills that did occur were properly documented and, if possible, turned into learning experiences. Professor Bofsworth Gigglesmith returned to her rubber duck research, though now she had funding from 17 different star systems and a research staff that included beings from 43 different species. Her latest paper, The Therapeutic Effects of Cosmic Absurdity on Interstellar Relations, had become required reading at diplomatic academies throughout the galaxy. She was working on a follow-up study titled Why Taking Things Too Seriously is Bad for Your Health and Probably Causes Space Madness, which had already been pre-ordered by universities on over 200 planets. The paper included groundbreaking research on the correlation between bureaucratic efficiency and clinical depression, the therapeutic value of rubber duck-based meditation, and the sociological implications of mandatory fun in government organizations. And Gerald became the first rubber duck to have an asteroid named after him, received the Galactic Peace Prize, was appointed as the official mascot of the newly formed Department of Universal Happiness, and had his own reality show called Gerald's Guide to Galactic Friendship. He remained characteristically modest about these honors, though he did develop a slight tendency to quack louder whenever photographers were present and had started wearing different hats for special occasions. His autobiography, From Bath Toy to Galactic Ambassador, One Duck's Journey to World Peace, had become a bestseller across 17 different species and was being translated into 43 languages. The universe, it turned out, was a much more interesting place when nobody was taking it too seriously. Wars became tea parties, bureaucracy became comedy, and somewhere in the vast expanse of space, beings who had forgotten how to smile were learning to laugh again. Children across the galaxy now grew up learning about the Great Rubber Duck War in their history classes, and rubber duck diplomacy had become a recognized field of study at major universities. The phrase, when in doubt, add rubber ducks, had become a popular saying among diplomats and military strategists. Tourist agencies had started offering rubber duck war historical tours that took visitors to the sites of the major battles, which had all been converted into amusement parks and tea shops. And the tours included stops at Gerald's original landing site, now marked with a monument shaped like a giant rubber duck, and the former crisis management room, which had been converted into a museum of bureaucratic inefficiency. On a quiet Tuesday morning, exactly 1 year after the Great Rubber Duck War, Zendrock Plimpington 7 sat at his new desk in his new office, sipping coffee that no longer tasted like liquid boredom, and began typing his final report. The office was decorated with pictures of rubber ducks, a small garden where he grew flowers that served no administrative purpose whatsoever, and a window that looked out on a universe that had suddenly become much more fun. His desk was equipped with the latest in anti-coffee spill technology, though he had discovered that controlled coffee spills could actually be quite useful for generating creative solutions to administrative problems. The department had established a controlled chaos initiative that used deliberately random events to break up bureaucratic logjams and encourage innovative thinking. Herbert, his pet filing cabinet, had been promoted to Assistant Director of Emotional Support Equipment, and now had his own business cards. Herbert had also learned to organize paperwork by entertainment value rather than just administrative importance, which had made reading government documents significantly more enjoyable. In conclusion, Zendrock typed, pausing occasionally to admire the small rubber duck collection that now decorated his workspace, the species known as humans have taught us that the most powerful weapon in the universe is not advanced technology, superior firepower, or strategic brilliance. It is the simple recognition that existence is so wonderfully ridiculous that the only sane response is to laugh, and the only logical reaction is to abandon logic entirely. He paused, considered adding something about proper filing procedures and administrative protocols, then decided against it. Those things were still important, but they didn't have to be miserable. Instead, he deleted that paragraph and typed his final sentence, the one that would close the official record of the Great Rubber Duck War and herald the beginning of what historians would later call the Age of Cosmic Silliness. They fired the first shot with coffee-stained confusion, but humanity fired the last shot with nothing more dangerous than joy. And that made all the difference in a universe that had forgotten how to smile.